Okay, so my name is Brandon Steele, and I'm going to be talking about Korean border and political disputes within China, focusing mostly on the Joseon area or time frame. But also, a lot of this has to do with what is happening today. My major is kind of more focused on political science, and so I care about history in as far as it affects the political stability of countries that are going on right there. Also, I don't speak Korean; I speak Chinese, so when I'm talking, I'm going to use Chinese references instead of Korean words because I actually don't know how to say Korean stuff. So the interesting thing that I have that draws me to Korea is its perspective to China, and that's really all I'm going to talk about as far as border disputes. I'm not going to talk about Japan really. China has 14 countries that border it, and that's more than any other country in the world except Russia, which ties it. They both have 14 bordering countries, and China has had border conflict with pretty much every single one of those countries, except maybe one, and I don't think that's really a country. It was like I don't know, something else. Although its relationship with Korea isn't nearly as bad. Like China has had physical and military battles with countries like India around these areas here, as well as I think Vietnam. And there are people that have died over border disputes between Korea and China, but it's not like all-out fighting usually. So the main, and one of the reasons that it might not be such a big deal is because the border obviously is so small. We just have the two rivers, the Yamen, was it?
Yemen.
Yalu
and Tumen.
Yalu and Tumen, yeah. And then there's like the caldera volcano in the middle that's dormant. So there's these two rivers here, and then Changbaishan, which is what it is in Chinese. It's Baekdusan. Okay, some people say it that way too. So that's really all there is that's separating it. And then also the Yellow Sea, which, there's a lot of conflict over who gets the rights to using these economic resources as well. And, historically you can kind of look at, okay, so this is what it looks like geographically today, and what happened in the past that made it look like this today. And so that's kind of what I'm interested in. Also, one other thing is China's only access, easy access to the EC or the Sea of Japan is from right here. Otherwise, I'd have to go all the way around Korea. So, in that sense, the Tumen River is kind of important. Yeah, so we already looked at this. Interestingly enough, Changbaishan is, there's been a lot of conflict around this over who gets how much of the volcano for some reason. There's nothing there. And we talked, in the previous presentation, we heard about how there's a lot of mythology that is related to it. And I think maybe China realizes how much it means to Korea, and so they like to use that to try and control North Korea. North Korea is kind of a crazy place, I'm not going to lie. So this is some history about Changbaishan and how the territory has changed hands, or the line has moved a little bit. So the Qing Emperor Kangxi, who lived around the 17th century, forced Korea to have the border go right through the middle of it. And then later on, there was more disputes over it with King Kojong, but Japan came in around that time, so that they didn't actually get together and resolve the dispute. And then even in within this last century, China used they were trying to take more of the land away from Korea because they helped North Korea during the Korean War. Now this is kind of more contested. There was an Indian newspaper that talked about this little piece here, and there's a North Korean diplomat that they were citing for that. And one of the other reasons, so this is going way back to the Three Kingdoms period, as well as, I guess, Four Kingdoms. You got Kaya right there. But you can see where, okay, so this is Manchuria here. In Goguryeo, at least for this map, their territory really cut into Manchuria. And, this is present-day China, and as well as Russia and Mongolia. And so you can kind of see why there might be some disagreements as to where the line is. And that doesn't, even aside from this, the rivers themselves are not actually as clear as what you think. Some people might say, well, there's a river there, let's just say at the river, that's where the boundary ends. But there's also islands inside the river, and it's well, who gets the islands? And so, and also, does China have the right to use the river to get out to the EC? So all these things are kind of they're important issues for both China and Korea to solve. And South Korea is actually in on this as well. I'm sure they hope one day to take over all of Korea, and so whatever happens to North Korea is kind of affecting them down the road, I think. So the other boundary issues between China and Korea is the Yellow Sea. This was a really interesting little piece. So since 2001, the South Korean boat people, Navy people, have confiscated 4,628 fishing boats from China. That's because China is just like this big hungry seafood country, and it just keeps encroaching more and more toward the Korean area of the ocean. And so the Korean Navy just keeps taking these boats. And so there's people that have died within these kinds of disputes as well, because the economic zones are really important here for a big growing China. And then South Korea definitely is a strong economic country as well. Okay, so this is going back a little more to the history. It's more applicable to the class now. So some of the border disputes that occurred, and I think affected Korea in a large sense, although it wasn't, all this. Obviously, Korea was failing when Joseon eventually came about. But there was tension between the Ming and Goryeo dynasties. Taizu from China was trying to increase his strength and take over kind of a little piece of Korea. And so that's Cholyong, the Cholyong Pass into Hamgyong. I think that's a part of Korea somewhere in the north. And so King Wu or Wu, how do you say this? Wu? Wu. Okay. King Wu and General Cholyong, they sent Lee Seong-ye. It's a pretty good pronunciation, right? And so he's going over to this suicide mission, and this is all focused on this dispute over who gets control of the border area. And he realizes that it's crazy, and so he turns around and because it's an act of treason to do that, he decides the only way to really survive, in my mind, is to have a coup. And so he takes over Korea, and at first he establishes a fake king, and then eventually he rallies his power and takes over, and that's the beginning of the Joseon dynasty. Interestingly enough, that little border dispute indirectly led to the Joseon dynasty. And then these are some last couple, I know Professor Peterson said that these were not really border disputes. It was mostly just the Qing dynasty trying to get recognition from the Joseon dynasty. But there's still, little skirmishes that, well, it wasn't a skirmish, the Qing dynasty did go into Korea and essentially take over, but they weren't really trying to dominate in the same way that Japan did or the Mongols did. But this is other disputes involving China and Korea. The first invasion was really to open up trade more and to get Korea to recognize the Manchus. And then the second invasion was to reaffirm that, I think, because the Ming dynasty was still interfering with the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty hadn't totally taken over the Ming yet, and so they're just really frustrated about that. So they wanted the backing of Joseon. So that's all right there. Are there any questions or? Okay, thank you.